If God could prevent one atrocity today without becoming less good, less wise, or less worthy of love, why would perfect love decline to act? We need not name the place. We need not describe the deed. It is enough to know that somewhere a human being meets an evil that no human being should be asked to bear. There is pain, fear, the long waiting for help that does not arrive, the anxiety of those who know something is wrong but cannot reach the wounded in time. And afterward there is brokenness, a burden carried by the sufferer, by those who love them, and perhaps by those who will never understand what was taken. At that moment theology stands under judgment. If it rushes first to defend heaven, it may appear to stand against the person crushed beneath the horror. If it reduces agony to an illustration, if it turns a wound into a neat instrument for proving a doctrine, it has defended the wrong thing. The sufferer is not material for our argument. The cry is not a decorative preface to philosophy. Before evil becomes a puzzle for the mind, it is an accusation uttered by the conscience. The accusation is severe because the contradiction appears severe. Unlimited power could act. Perfect goodness would desire to act. Yet evil is permitted to act. Remove any one of those claims and the tension weakens. Preserve all three, and belief enters a battlefield from which clever language cannot rescue it. For what would we say of a love that possessed the power to stop the worst and chose restraint? Would we praise its hidden wisdom or condemn its refusal? Believer and skeptic must stand together here, at least long enough to hear the question without corruption. Doubt will not be treated as treason. Outrage will not be silenced, as though moral protest were itself immoral. Nor will disbelief be granted an easy victory merely because the wound is real. We shall strengthen the accusation before asking whether it is final, and test every answer against two tribunals: moral logic and personal grief. The test must be severe enough to expose shallow denial on one side and sentimental defense on the other. Belief in a good and powerful God deserves no shelter from the full force of evil. Yet perhaps belief may endure that force without pretending to explain every wound. That possibility must not be assumed. It must be tried beside the suffering itself, where the anguish of conscience becomes a formal charge against heaven. To receive that charge honestly, we must translate anguish into argument without pretending that translation makes anguish less than human. The alleged collision is plain. Perfect goodness opposes what destroys the innocent. Unlimited power is not prevented by weakness. Complete knowledge is not surprised by the moment of danger or the consequence that follows. Yet suffering occurs, and often proceeds beyond the point at which intervention seems not only possible but morally demanded. If these claims belong together, the skeptic asks, why does the world so often appear as though they do not? One must be precise. Evil's existence alone may not establish a strict contradiction. It remains possible, at least in logic, that God permits some evil for morally sufficient reasons, goods that could not otherwise exist, freedoms that cannot be genuine without risk, or consequences inseparable from an ordered creation. The mere possibility of such reasons may answer the narrow claim that God and evil cannot coexist under any conceivable conditions. But possibility is not probability, and logical escape is not moral vindication. The sharper accusation concerns the world we actually encounter, not merely suffering, but its quantity, intensity, distribution, and apparent pointlessness. Why so much? Why so severe? Why concentrated upon some lives while others pass comparatively unharmed? Why does agony sometimes destroy rather than deepen, isolate rather than reconcile, and end before any visible good could answer its cost? It is here that the objection acquires its greatest force. The formidable claim is not that no suffering could ever be permitted by goodness, but that much suffering appears to have no reason worthy of what it consumes. Nor may the field be narrowed to human cruelty. Some evil proceeds through deliberate choice, and any later appeal to freedom must answer for that territory. But disease is not always chosen. Disaster does not require malice. Animals suffer without having designed the order in which they suffer. Bodies fail, minds deteriorate, and lives are struck by harms no human intention appears to have originated. A defense that addresses the weapon but not the illness, the betrayal but not the catastrophe, has not answered evil. It has answered one province of it. We must therefore grant the skeptic the hardest cases, not the manageable pains from which courage plainly grows or wisdom conveniently emerges. The question is not whether believers can decode every tragedy, as though Providence owed us an exhaustive map of every hidden road. The question is whether belief can remain rational and morally defensible when no such map is given, whether divine goodness can be coherent without being emptied into a word that excuses whatever happens. That is a limited verdict, but not an evasive one. Rational survival is less than complete explanation, yet far more than inventing a mystery whenever the argument becomes unbearable. And before any defense is heard, another question must govern the inquiry. What intellectual victory could be worth gaining if its price were compassion, consistency, or the right to call horror evil? Then the manner of answering becomes part of the answer itself. No response is honorable merely because it is ingenious, and no argument becomes compassionate merely because its conclusion is true. Reason must enter this conflict, for grief does not abolish logic, but reason must enter under the discipline of love, knowing that a wounded person is never an obstacle to be overcome. We must first distinguish two ambitions often confused. A defense attempts to show that God and evil are not necessarily incompatible, that their coexistence need not be contradictory. A theodicy goes further, proposing reasons why God might permit certain kinds of suffering. The first establishes possibility, the second ventures toward explanation. Neither may quietly claim more than it has earned. A conceivable reason is not therefore the likely reason, and a principle capable of describing a class of evils does not reveal why this person endured this tragedy. This boundary is morally decisive. We shall reject any answer that renames evil as goodness, as though cruelty became holy when placed inside a sufficiently grand design. We shall reject any answer that blames the wounded simply for bearing wounds or converts their anguish into material for someone else's moral education. And we shall resist premature certainty, that strange confidence by which the observer announces the purpose of a pain whose weight the observer does not carry. Nor must argument and consolation be mistaken for the same task. A contradiction may be answered in a lecture. Grief cannot be answered in that manner. The correct reasoning, delivered at the wrong bedside, may become an act of cruelty not because truth is cruel, but because truth without attention can be used cruelly. Sometimes love speaks, sometimes love defends, sometimes love refuses to explain what it cannot know and remains present without pretending that presence dissolves loss. Each response must therefore face four tests. What is its logical reach? Which objection does it actually answer? What is its moral cost? Does it preserve the reality of evil and the dignity of those harmed? What are its explanatory limits? What remains unaccounted for? And what use can it have in the presence of grief? Can it accompany sorrow without silencing it? These standards will permit no easy verdict. An argument may be accepted within its proper borders, limited where it overreaches, or refused where it purchases order by diminishing the sufferer. With those boundaries fixed, we may turn to the most influential defense, the dangerous dignity of freedom, where the possibility of love first appears inseparable from the possibility of refusal. Begin, then, with the logical reach of freedom. A creature whose conduct is guaranteed in advance may be harmless, but harmlessness is not yet virtue. A mechanism does not become honest because it cannot deceive, nor faithful because betrayal lies beyond its design. Love, trust, courage, and obedience acquire moral significance only where another course is genuinely possible. If created persons are to do more than exhibit programmed innocence, they must possess some power to withhold themselves from the good. Yet that power cannot be divided neatly, giving us devotion while excluding defiance. The capacity by which one person offers loyalty is the same capacity by which another violates it. A gift may be turned against its giver's purpose. Intelligence may devise cruelty. Strength may enforce it. Speech may deceive. Freedom itself may become an instrument of domination. This does not make the gift evil, but it makes evil possible in a world containing agents rather than puppets. We must therefore distinguish what is often confused. To permit an action is not necessarily to approve it. To allow another will to operate is not to author its intention, endorse its object, or regard its victim with indifference. The wrong belongs morally to the one who wills it, even if the power to will was received as a good. On the first test, then, freedom gains real ground. It shows why a good God might create beings capable of rebellion without desiring rebellion itself. But the stronger objection has been waiting. Freedom is never unlimited. Weakness interrupts intention. Circumstance closes opportunities. Other persons restrain us. A locked door may prevent a crime without purifying the criminal, and a timely interruption may preserve the intended victim while leaving the guilty purpose entirely exposed. Why, then, could divine power not permit the choice yet prevent its most devastating result? Why must respect for the offender's agency include permission for the innocent to bear its furthest consequences? One answer is that choices matter partly because they enter a common world and alter what follows. If every malicious act were invisibly disarmed, every betrayal rendered harmless, and every violent purpose detached from consequence, action might become a kind of moral pantomime. We would still form intentions, but we would no longer inhabit a dependable field of responsibility in which our decisions genuinely affect one another. Constant miraculous containment could preserve the appearance of agency while draining agency of seriousness. This is a coherent reply, but not a complete one. It may explain why consequences cannot be abolished as a class. It does not explain why intervention could not be selective, why some horrors are interrupted and others proceed, or why any particular act is permitted to inflict the whole measure of its damage. Here the moral cost remains severe, the explanatory limit unmistakable, and the usefulness beside grief restrained. One may say that freedom made the assault possible. One must not tell the wounded that their devastation was therefore required. Nor does freedom govern every region of suffering. It does not by itself account for disease, disaster, animal pain, or the unequal burdens falling upon those who chose none of them. Free will defeats the demand for persons who are both meaningfully free and causally incapable of wrongdoing. It does not defeat the entire accusation. It explains why love may permit rebellion to become possible. It has not explained why providence allows rebellion to cut so deep. That unanswered depth turns us toward the material order in which choices acquire stable and terrible force. Why, then, does divine action not repeatedly interrupt the harmful consequences that freedom sets in motion? Part of the answer may lie not only in the nature of the will, but in the nature of the world upon which the will acts. Embodied creatures require more than intentions. They require a reality stable enough to be known, resistant enough to matter, and shared enough for one person's knowledge to become another person's warning. We learn because causes ordinarily resemble themselves. We plan because tomorrow is not wholly detached from today. We work, cooperate, protect, and rescue because actions have consequences that can be anticipated. Responsibility depends upon this continuity. If the material world answered every desire differently, if weight, motion, heat, and consequence shifted according to an invisible preference, wisdom could scarcely mature beyond guesswork. There would be no common order to understand, only an endless succession of exceptions. Here physical regularity reveals its double edge. Fire can warm a dwelling and consume it. The same dependable properties that make preparation possible also make destruction possible. Bodies capable of movement can collide. Living systems capable of growth can become diseased. The forces that sustain an inhabitable world can also bring disaster. Order permits warning, labor, medicine, shelter, and rescue, yet it does not promise that the innocent will always reach safety before the consequence arrives. A world in which every injury were secretly cancelled would therefore bear a grave cost. Cause and effect would cease to be intelligible precisely where their effects became dangerous. The blow might fall without wounding, the contagion spread without illness, the collapsing structure spare every person beneath it. Such mercy would appear desirable in each instance, but if universal and constant, it might make embodied action opaque. We could no longer know what our powers meant, what dangers required resistance, or which acts genuinely protected another. Yet one must not pass from this modest claim to a merciless conclusion. The need for regularity does not prove the necessity of every catastrophe. To say that a lawful world carries risk is not to say that this exact anguish, in this measure, visited upon this life, was indispensable. Stable causes may explain how natural suffering is possible. They do not explain why its realized cost is so unequal, why some are spared while others are overwhelmed, or why the price sometimes appears grotesquely beyond any good secured by it. Natural order therefore joins freedom as a condition of meaningful existence, not as a complete vindication of history. The structure is not itself evil, but suffering can advance through its regularities with terrible force. And when it does, we must turn from the architecture of the world to the person crushed within it. Perhaps adversity can become an occasion for courage, compassion, or growth. But that possibility raises a more dangerous question: whether moral formation can be affirmed without treating another person's agony as the material from which virtue is made. The attraction of this argument must be admitted before its danger is exposed. Courage cannot arise where nothing threatens. Mercy has no object where no one is wounded. Endurance presupposes a burden. Forgiveness presupposes a wrong. Sacrificial care becomes possible only where another person possesses a need that love may choose to bear. A world without vulnerability might contain innocence of a kind, but it could not contain these particular victories of character, for there would be nothing to endure, forgive, rescue, or surrender for. Yet the decisive distinction is not between suffering and virtue, but between what suffering is and what love may do in its presence. Good may be brought out of evil, without evil becoming good. A wound may become the place where fidelity appears, but fidelity does not make the wound innocent. Compassion may answer anguish, but anguish is not justified merely because compassion answered. To confuse redemption with permission is to grant suffering a moral dignity it does not possess. The problem becomes sharper when proportion is considered. Some adversity may strengthen resolution, deepen sympathy, or strip away a destructive illusion. Other suffering appears to do the opposite. It can diminish the powers by which growth occurs, imprison attention within pain, destroy trust, silence hope, or end a life before any visible transformation has begun. One cannot simply pronounce that every blow educates. Some blows seem only to break, and any theory that refuses to see this has protected its conclusion by abandoning the person. Still more offensive is the claim that one person's devastation may be vindicated by the virtue it awakens in another. It is good when strangers become merciful, when families remain faithful, when costly care rises against despair. But the sufferer is not expendable simply because observers learn compassion. Another person's ruin cannot be converted into our moral opportunity, as though their loss were the tuition demanded for our improvement. Love may summon rescuers through suffering. It does not therefore treat the wounded as instruments belonging to the rescuers. Soul-making can survive, then, only in a disciplined form. It may describe rescue, not explanation. It may tell us that suffering is not sovereign, that character can resist what pain attempts to destroy, and that goodness may arise within conditions goodness did not approve. It cannot tell us that every tragedy was assigned as a lesson, that each measure of pain was required, or that visible growth has repaid the cost. Beside grief, this modest claim must become more modest still. We may hope that love can work within the ruins without instructing the wounded to admire them. Redemption, if it comes, does not cancel protest. It gives protest reason not to surrender. Yet many ruins disclose no proportionate good at all. If reasons remain, they lie beyond what we can see, and that possibility leads toward another peril, whether hidden wisdom is genuine humility or merely an alibi devised when every visible answer has failed. The unanswered cases remain. The catastrophe no freedom required, the anguish no stable order appears to need, the life in which suffering produced no visible transformation. Here reason approaches the boundary of its sight. Yet a boundary is not a conclusion. To say, I can discover no sufficient reason, is not identical to saying, I can see that no sufficient reason exists. The first describes our knowledge. The second makes a claim about reality as a whole. This modest distinction limits certainty on both sides. The believer may not survey an obscure tragedy and confidently announce providence's purpose. The skeptic, likewise, may not assume that because every relevant consequence is hidden from finite vision, none can exist. We do not know enough for effortless triumph. But neither does ignorance reverse the evidence before us. Apparent pointlessness remains evidence, especially when suffering is extreme and unevenly borne. It simply does not become omniscience. The comparison with a parent and child is sometimes offered here. A child may not understand why a loving parent permits a painful treatment whose necessity the parent understands. The analogy proves only that unequal knowledge can coexist with love. Used beyond that narrow point, it becomes crude. The sufferer may receive no explanation, no immediate assurance, no recognizable healing, and no trusted face whose presence makes the pain intelligible. Adult grief cannot be silenced by telling the wounded that they are merely children unable to comprehend what is being done to them. Still greater danger appears when mystery is made indiscriminate. If every horror can be protected by an unknown justification, then our moral judgments begin to lose their force. Cruelty may be left unchallenged because some concealed purpose is imagined. Neglect may disguise itself as submission. Preventable harm may proceed while intervention is condemned as interference with a design no one can identify. At that point, mystery has ceased to humble reason and has begun to disable conscience. We must therefore hold two truths without allowing either to destroy the other. We may lack the knowledge required to judge the whole universe meaningless, yet possess more than enough knowledge to recognize cruelty, neglect, and needless injury as evils to be opposed. Uncertainty about why providence permits an event does not create uncertainty about whether we should rescue, protect, heal, and resist. Divine restraint, whatever its reason, is never a license for human indifference. Mystery is therefore a boundary marker, not a completed defense. It prevents the accusation from claiming total knowledge, but it cannot bear the full weight of God's vindication or dissolve the force of grief. Humility may restrain triumphant judgment. It must never forbid lament or command us to call darkness light. And this leaves a deeper question. When conscience condemns the world, what standard of good gives that condemnation its authority? The authority of moral protest need not weaken when our knowledge of providence reaches its limit. Indeed, the problem of evil possesses its force because suffering is judged as more than painful. Pain may be disliked, evil is condemned. We speak as though cruelty violates something, as though innocence ought not be crushed, as though reality itself has failed to honor a measure it did not invent. That ought is difficult to dismiss as preference alone. Preferences differ, conventions change, and societies can approve what conscience rightly indicts. Yet when we condemn an atrocity, we do not mean merely that our community has voted against it or that our feelings recoil from it. We mean that it should not have occurred, even if every witness had applauded and every law had permitted it. Moral protest claims an authority greater than appetite, agreement, or advantage. Theism offers an account of that authority. It proposes that goodness is not a temporary human construction within an indifferent universe, but is rooted in ultimate reality, in a goodness prior to our judgments and capable of judging them. On this view, conscience does not manufacture value from nothing. It responds, however imperfectly, to a moral order deeper than preference. But no cheap victory follows. Skeptics can recognize evil, defend the vulnerable, accept sacrifice, and display a moral seriousness that rebukes believers. The question concerns the foundation of moral knowledge, not who possesses it. Its grounding, not the decency or sincerity of the person who acts upon it. To say that an atheist cannot condemn evil is both false to experience and evasive in argument. Nor may the believer seize moral outrage as a weapon that silences the accusation. If our protest points beyond the material world toward an ultimate good, it also presses the charge against the government of that good. The more objective the obligation to protect the innocent, the more urgent becomes the question of why perfect love permits their devastation. One cannot invoke the moral law to establish heaven and then dismiss that same law when it summons heaven to account. The moral law is therefore a clue, not a solution. It may make evil philosophically strange if reality is finally indifferent, but it does not explain why a particular child suffers, why help is delayed, or why unequal anguish is permitted. The measure by which we accuse God may itself bear witness to God. Still, the accusation remains. Abstract goodness has carried us only this far. We must now ask whether Christianity offers merely a distant source of moral order, or a God who enters the suffering for which God stands accused, and whether that participation changes only the believer's posture, or the rational horizon of the problem itself. The question now changes its form, though not its severity. General theism may speak of an ultimate good, a moral order, or reasons beyond our sight. Christianity makes a more dangerous claim. It says that the source of goodness did not remain beyond the reach of creaturely anguish, issuing decrees from safety. In the cross, God enters rejection, injustice, bodily pain, abandonment, and death. He does not merely observe the human condition, he accepts its violence into himself. We must not mistake this for an explanation. To share another's suffering is not, by that act alone, to justify having permitted it. If one could prevent a wound, willingly receiving a similar wound does not answer why the first was allowed. Divine solidarity cannot identify the sufficient reason for each tragedy, account for unequal suffering, or tell us why rescue came too late. The cross must never be used to silence the sufferer with the announcement that God also suffered. Yet participation changes the moral character of the claim being examined. The Christian is not defending a ruler who demands from others a cost he refuses to approach. The power accused of permitting suffering is said to bear suffering, not as a spectator imitating grief, but as love submitting to the consequences of a world estranged from love. This does not make permission transparent. It does deny that permission must mean indifference, immunity, or contempt. But the cross alone would leave the argument suspended in sacred tragedy. Christianity therefore joins it to resurrection. The claim is not that later happiness makes earlier agony negligible, as though eternity performed an arithmetic in which every terror became small. What was violated remains worthy of judgment. What was lost remains worthy of grief. Resurrection declares something different, that death possesses power, but not sovereignty, that evil may destroy without acquiring the right to define forever what it destroyed. For that hope to be morally serious, restoration must include judgment. Perfect goodness cannot merely comfort the wounded while leaving the violation unnamed. It must expose falsehood, condemn cruelty, vindicate those treated as expendable, and overcome the forces that made their suffering possible. Mercy without moral truth would become sentiment. Judgment without restoration would leave ruin enthroned. Christian hope requires both, evil answered as evil, and the person harmed recovered beyond evil's final reach. This is why lament need not be faith's opposite. Protest addressed to God may still be speech within relationship. The cry of apparent abandonment does not cease to be prayer merely because it contains no serenity. When explanations fail, faith may remain as accusation, appeal, and refusal to let silence become the only language between suffering and God. Still, everything depends upon the promise being true. If death ends the possibility of restoration, then many injustices remain permanently unanswered, many losses irretrievable, and divine participation offers companionship without victory. Christianity has not reduced its wager, it has enlarged it. The cross and resurrection do not explain why each wound was permitted. They declare that God has borne the cost, judged the enemy, and pledged that even the grave shall not make the wound final. Whether that is enough for rational trust must now be tested against the atrocity with which we began. We return, then, to the preventable horror from which this inquiry began. Why was it not stopped? No principle examined here reveals the answer. Freedom may account for the offender's capacity to rebel, but not for the full injury permitted. A dependable creation may explain how actions acquire consequences, but not why protection failed at that hour. To invent a hidden purpose would be to offer imagination where knowledge is required. Yet the argument has not accomplished nothing. Freedom shows that moral agency includes the possibility of refusal. Natural order provides the stable arena in which knowledge, responsibility, danger, and rescue become real. Transformation shows that evil need not command every consequence it produces, though no victim exists for another's improvement. Our limited sight restrains claims of certainty without turning mystery into an excuse. Moral protest bears witness to a goodness deeper than preference, and the Christian claims of cross and resurrection offer not a reason for the atrocity, but divine solidarity with the afflicted and the promise that judgment and restoration lie beyond death. The verdict must therefore be exact. Evil does not make Christian belief logically impossible. The cumulative case leaves room for rational trust. But apparently pointless suffering continues to weigh against that trust, not only as evidence before the mind, but as pressure upon the heart. The believer has not conquered the accusation. The accusation, however, has not proved final. This is not a choice between faith and protest. One may trust while demanding an answer, think clearly while grieving, and hope while confessing that hope remains conditional upon a promise not yet publicly fulfilled. Nor does belief permit withdrawal from the world's anguish. If God possesses reasons beyond our understanding, those reasons have not been entrusted to us as permission to stand aside. Where harm can be prevented, the human duty is not speculation but protection. Where suffering cannot be reversed, the duty is presence, care, truthful remembrance, and resistance to every lie that would make the wounded expendable. Faith survives here without pretending to have won. It survives as patience without complacency, humility without moral confusion, and hope without manufactured closure. It refuses to bless the horror merely because providence allowed it, and refuses to grant the horror everlasting dominion merely because its purpose remains unseen. We must therefore keep conscience awake, stand near those whose grief has no neat conclusion, oppose cruelty and neglect wherever our hands can reach, and allow unanswered sorrow its rightful voice. Perhaps this is the final posture available to honest belief, not standing beyond the wound with an explanation, but beside it with lament, defiance, and a hope that will not call the darkness good, and will not concede that darkness is forever.